the earlier, I guess, theories and models, and if you look at different research papers from those original authors, I guess one way to look at working memory is that it is part of short-term memory, although it is way more relevant to the entire concept, and especially when we talk about age differences. So we're only going to be mostly focusing on working memory. And also when you think about short-term memory originally, it was almost conceptualized as a rather passive and short-term storage of information. It doesn't really include the manipulation and organization of material. Whereas working memory, working, it means you're actively trying to store something while manipulating it. Okay? So two things at least are happening at the same time with working memory. And it's great because it's doing a lot of things. It's a very important concept in cognitive aging, not just for memory, but for a whole bunch of things. It's relevant to language processing. It's also relevant to planning, calculation, reasoning, control, decision-making, things like that. Has anybody heard of the idea of executive function? Well, some people also want to lump these things together. And it's beyond the scope of today's lecture, but I guess what I would say is that they're also relevant concepts. They're interconnected. Okay? So could somebody give me an example of an active cognitive process in working memory? What does that mean, working memory? How do you try to store something while manipulating it?
Like writing stuff down right now during this lecture, we're thinking about what you're saying, and I'm doing my best to put it in the long term so I can use it later, but kind of mulling it over and making sense of it.
So, yeah. So, the idea is that, yes, you're trying to retain something and you're trying to actively manipulate that as well. So, that can be a way to look at what the working memory does. Yes?
You can relate it to things you've already learned.
Okay.
Like that you already have in memory.
How does that happen?
Well, in memory, isn't it kind of like a web that everything's slightly connected and there's like pathways where you...
Right. What you brought up actually is another very prominent idea or theory, the connectionist model, in which case things are all interconnected, especially if we're thinking about storage as well. But also, even though what we see here is, we only see one-way arrows, one in one direction. But actually, sometimes people would see this as like a sketch pad. And you constantly modify things. It's like a working space, pretty much. So in a way, sometimes what, like in your example, what people might be doing is to pull out some stuff using the search processes to pull out some information from the long-term memory, put it in the working memory, and try to further process new information to put things into other categories and so on. So yeah, the working memory definitely works in that manner as well. It's like a working space. Okay? It is temporary. It's really short. So once again, it requires both storage and also manipulation of new information. Now, when we talk about age differences, what do you think will show up in terms of people's working memory or short-term memory? Do you think older adults tend to have better working memory or worse? How many of you think their working memory would be worse? In general, as they age. Okay. How many of you think that they would become better? We're talking about the general population, the average. No? Okay. Then let me tell you what I know. Okay, based on what I've read. So if we're only talking about the passive short-term memory, like a memory span. For example, if you give them 7 to 8 numbers to repeat in the exact same order. Usually people do really well, whether they're young or old. They can handle that fairly well. It's fine. So here we're talking about the more passive type of short-term memory. It's relatively short, relatively easy. Just give them a whole bunch of numbers, ask them to repeat it. Fine. Now, if we're talking about things like working memory, in the sense that some manipulation is required. For example, if you give them a list of numbers, a bunch of irrelevant numbers, this time you ask them, I would like you to repeat these numbers in the opposite direction after I'm done. So say if I give you 213, what are you supposed to say? 312, right, exactly. So this time it's both holding on to something and also manipulating it a little bit at the same time. And in that task, there seems to be more aging-related differences compared to the more straightforward, passive type of short-term memory. So the bottom line is that the capacity of working memory seems to go downhill as we age.
So it's harder for older adults to do
It's
something
harder.
like that.
Or it would take longer. So, so some people may be wondering I may be wondering, if I'm listening to this for the first time, how big is our working memory? How much information do you think we keep in the working memory each time?
Depends on which theory.
Huh?
Depends on which theory.
Depends on your theory. That's a
I
good
think it
point.
depends also on the type of information you're dealing with. Like if you're with some subject with which you're familiar and comfortable versus something that's new and foreign.
Mm-hmm. That's a very, very good idea because it's hugely relevant to why there may be age differences in general, actually, in memory. The idea of resources, the idea of familiarity. We'll go back and revisit those things later. So I guess the bottom line is for you to see that working memory tends to be worse as we age. It's also very vulnerable to interruption or interference. Because essentially what the working memory is also doing is to try very hard to make sure things get passed down to long-term memory. And you only have so much cognitive capacity and attention to handle and manipulate things each time. So if there are a lot of things, other things going on in the environment, then maybe you won't be able to process those things equally well. So far, we're talking about working memory. But I keep going back to the term short-term memory. The reason why I'm trying to bring up the term short-term memory is that, usually, a lot of you told me that you work with people with a memory problem, or you work with older adults. What do a lot of them like to say about their short-term memory? Or when you ask them about their memory, what would they say? Or maybe it's just me who has experienced that.
They say that they remember things further back better than they remember more recent things.
And I think we can explain that, right? Can we not?
Well, if they had poor encoding as they got older, it would be easier for them to bring up long-term memories that were encoded properly.
Yeah, that's very possible. If we're looking at the encoding part, if we go back to the previous model, maybe they were better at encoding information when they were younger. So those things got stored and they're better preserved, and so it's easier for them to retrieve those things. Whereas new information, recent stuff, maybe they're just not encoding it as well. That's why it's harder for them to remember it. But I guess I was actually thinking about another. It was probably just my observation. It's very interesting though. Tell me if you have experienced that as well. When I work with older adults, a lot of times they would say, "Oh, I have very poor short-term memory, but my long-term memory is fine."